The day after my husband was buried, his son stood in the doorway of the home I had spent 18 years helping build and said, without the slightest hesitation, "It's my mother's name. My mother's house. You don't belong here anymore." The words didn't echo. They landed. Behind him, cardboard boxes lined. The hallway, like someone had already decided my life, could be packed into neat corners. The framed family photographs I'd dusted every Sunday were gone from the mantel. In their place sat a single portrait of his late mother, polished so carefully it looked as though I had never existed. I tightened my fingers around the black coat I still hadn't taken off since the funeral. The scent of lilies clung to the fabric, mixing with fresh paint, and the coffee someone else had brewed in my kitchen. "No to your kitchen." His eyes never softened. "Take what you brought with you," he said. "Everything else stays." I looked past him at the staircase, my husband, and I had argued over for weeks because I insisted on solid oak instead of laminate. I remembered choosing every window, every light fixture, every stone on the fireplace while my husband laughed that I treated blueprints like love letters. His son remembered none of that. He hadn't been there when the bank rejected our first construction loan. He hadn't watched me sell the small apartment I had inherited from my parents so we could cover the shortfall. He hadn't seen the wire transfer that quietly rescued the entire project when costs exploded halfway through construction. All he saw was the deed. His mother's name was on it. That was enough for him to believe the house belonged to history instead of truth. Neighbors watched discreetly through half-open curtains as he carried my suitcase onto the porch and set it beside a potted rose bush I had planted with my own hands. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move. I should have cried. I should have begged. Instead, I memorized every detail. The brass doorknob, the fresh scratch across the hardwood floor, the smug certainty on his face. Because certainty has a peculiar weakness. It never expects receipts. As the front door closed between us with one quiet click, I reached into my handbag and touched the worn leather folder I had carried to the funeral by accident. Inside rested copies of documents no one else had ever bothered to read. Not the bank, not the lawyer, and certainly not the man who had just thrown me out of the only home he'd ever known. He believed he had inherited a house. He had no idea whose money had built it, and he knew even less about the woman whose inheritance had quietly paid for almost every brick. I never imagined I would become the woman standing on a sidewalk with a suitcase, locked out of the home she had spent nearly 2 decades creating. My name is Eleanor, and for most of my life I believed loyalty spoke for itself. I wasn't loud, demanding, or interested in winning arguments. I simply showed up, solved problems, and kept families together while everyone else assumed things somehow worked on their own. When I married Richard, he was already a widower with a teenage son, Daniel. I never tried to replace Daniel's mother. That place belonged to her, and I respected it from the beginning. I attended his school plays from the last row, applauded every graduation, remembered every birthday, and accepted that he called me Eleanor instead of Mom. Love, I believed, could exist without forcing a title. Richard understood my quiet nature because it matched his own. We made decisions over coffee instead of shouting across rooms. When money became tight during the construction of our dream home, we faced it together, privately. I handled the numbers because finance had always been my strength, though very few people noticed. To most relatives, I was simply Richard's dependable wife, the woman arranging dinners, balancing schedules, and smiling politely while others took credit for plans I had organized. That invisibility became my reputation. Family members assumed I had married into comfort, never asking what I had contributed before I arrived. They admired the finished house without knowing how many nights I spent reviewing contracts, negotiating with lenders, or quietly transferring my own savings to keep construction alive. Richard knew every sacrifice I made, but he rarely corrected people when they praised him alone. It wasn't arrogance. It was habit, and I let that habit grow because I cared more about our future than about applause. Daniel inherited the same assumptions as everyone else. He saw his father as the provider, his late mother as the rightful owner, and me as a temporary chapter that happened to last 18 years. He mistook my silence for dependence, my kindness for weakness, and my patience for permission to overlook me. By the time Richard died, those quiet misunderstandings had hardened into certainty. The cruelest part wasn't that Daniel underestimated me. It was that he truly believed I had nothing left to lose. The weeks before Richard's funeral revealed more about Daniel than the previous 18 years ever had. Grief did not change him. It simply removed the courtesy that had kept his opinions hidden. He stopped asking whether I needed anything and began speaking as though I were a guest whose visit had quietly run too long. When relatives gathered in the living room to discuss arrangements, he answered every question directed at me before I could open my mouth. If someone asked where Richard had kept an important document, Daniel would glance toward me for the briefest second before replying, "I'll handle it." The pause was polite enough to escape notice, yet deliberate enough for me to understand my place had already been reduced. I noticed smaller things too. My favorite chair disappeared beneath stacks of paperwork that no one offered to move. My coffee mug was replaced with disposable cups because, as Daniel casually remarked, we're trying to simplify things. Every decision carried the same quiet message. You no longer live here, even if no one has said it aloud. One afternoon, I walked into Richard's study and found Daniel unlocking the old walnut filing cabinet. He closed the drawer the moment he heard my footsteps. "Just organizing," he said with an easy smile that never reached his eyes. "I know where everything is," I answered gently. "I'm sure you did." The past tense lingered between us. Later that evening, I overheard him speaking with his aunt in the dining room. Neither realized I was standing in the hallway. "Once the estate paperwork is finished," Daniel said calmly, "things can finally go back to the way they were." His aunt lowered her voice. "And Eleanor?" A long silence followed. "I'm sure she'll understand." No anger, no hesitation. Just quiet confidence. That confidence spread through the family with surprising speed. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. People offered sympathetic smiles without asking how I planned to live. They assumed someone else had already decided my future. Only Richard's attorney behaved differently. At the funeral reception, he caught my eye from across the room. He didn't offer condolences first. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It lasted less than a second, but it told me something Daniel had completely overlooked. Someone else knew the whole story. The morning Daniel placed my final box on the porch, I drove away without arguing. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller until it disappeared behind a line of maple trees. Richard and I had planted the first spring after construction was finished. I thought I would feel defeated. Instead, I felt strangely clear. For years, I had confused keeping the peace with protecting what was mine. Richard had always promised we would straighten out the paperwork. When things slowed down, life never slowed down. Then illness arrived, and after that came funerals, condolences, and silence. By noon, I was sitting across from Richard's attorney, the same man who had nodded at me during the reception. He opened a thick file without asking why I had come. "I've been expecting you," he said quietly. Inside were documents I had almost forgotten existed, bank transfers from my inherited investment account, loan agreements bearing my signature, correspondence with the builder, and a notarized reimbursement contract. Richard had insisted on signing years earlier. He had called it a formality in case anything ever happened to him. I had tucked it away and never thought about it again. The attorney slid the final document toward me. "Legally," he said, "your contribution wasn't a gift. It was a protected financial interest." I read every page slowly. For the first time since Richard's death, the truth existed somewhere stronger than memory. It existed in signatures, dates, and records that couldn't be dismissed as emotion. Daniel had inherited confidence. I had inherited proof. As I closed the file, I realized I wasn't seeking revenge for being thrown out. I was simply finished allowing other people to rewrite the story of what I had built. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't send angry messages or ask relatives to take my side. People expecting an emotional fight are rarely prepared for a quiet legal process, and I had spent enough years working with contracts to know that facts move farther than outrage. For nearly a week, I treated my own life like a financial audit. Every evening, I spread documents across the dining table in my small rental apartment and arranged them in chronological order. Bank statements, wire transfers, construction invoices, loan approvals, emails with the builder explaining cost overruns. Every receipt told the same story from a different angle. And together they formed one undeniable timeline. Richard had trusted me with every major financial decision because numbers were my profession long before we married. As a senior financial controller, I had negotiated budgets worth millions without raising my voice. I understood documentation, paper trails, and the difference between ownership on paper and equitable interest under the law. That knowledge had once protected companies from costly disputes. Now it would protect me. Richard's attorney introduced me to a property litigation specialist who approached the case without emotion. He wasn't interested in family arguments or wounded feelings. He wanted evidence. I gave him evidence. He reviewed every file, compared signatures, verified transfers, and finally leaned back with a measured smile. "They've mistaken your silence for the absence of rights," he said. "We filed the necessary claims without announcing them to anyone. No dramatic confrontations. No social media posts. No whispered campaigns among relatives. Every notice would arrive through official channels exactly as the law intended." While Daniel celebrated what he believed was a settled inheritance, the foundation beneath his certainty was already beginning to shift. He just hadn't opened the envelope yet. The hearing lasted less than 2 hours, yet it erased months of quiet assumptions. Daniel arrived with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. He barely looked at me as he took his seat across the room. To him, I was still the woman he had asked to leave with a single suitcase. I noticed the same calm expression he had worn on the porch, as though certainty itself could outweigh evidence. It couldn't. My attorney spoke only when necessary. There were no dramatic speeches, no attempts to embarrass anyone. One document after another was placed before the court. The wire transfers that had covered the construction shortfall, the reimbursement agreement Richard had signed, the correspondence linking my inheritance directly to the completion of the house. Each page quietly dismantled the story Daniel had been telling. For the first time, I watched him stop taking notes. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispered something, then looked back at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was disbelief. The judge asked a few careful questions, reviewed the financial records once more, and delivered the ruling in an even voice. My legal interest in the property was undeniable. The estate could not simply erase my contribution, because my name wasn't on the original deed. The room fell completely silent, not because anyone had lost their temper, because the truth had finally caught up with everyone. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. There was no applause, no dramatic confrontation on the courthouse steps. Just a cool breeze and the sound of traffic moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Daniel walked past me without speaking. For the first time since Richard's death, he understood that the house had never been built on assumptions. It had been built on promises, records, and the woman he had never thought to see. The news traveled through the family faster than any explanation ever could. Relatives who had quietly accepted. Daniel's version of events suddenly began calling, not to argue, but to ask questions they should have asked from the beginning. They wanted to know whether I had really paid for so much of the house, whether Richard had truly intended to protect my investment, whether they had misunderstood me all those years. I answered each question without bitterness. The documents spoke more clearly than I ever could. Some apologized. Others never did. A few simply disappeared, embarrassed by how easily they had mistaken silence for weakness. I didn't chase any of them. Relationships built on assumptions rarely survive the truth, and I had stopped measuring my worth by who chose to stay. Daniel changed too, not overnight and not dramatically. He no longer spoke with effortless certainty. The confidence that had once filled every room became cautious, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that inheritance is more than a name written on a deed. It also carries the responsibility of knowing how that legacy came to exist. As for me, I didn't feel victorious in the way people imagine revenge should feel. I felt lighter. For months, I had been defending not just my legal rights, but the life Richard and I had built together. The ruling didn't bring him back. It didn't erase the loneliness of an empty chair at dinner or the habit of reaching for someone who was no longer there. What it restored was something quieter. My place in my own story. That's why this matters. Because people often believe the loudest voice owns the truth. In reality, truth belongs to the person who can patiently preserve it until the moment it finally has to be heard. Sometimes dignity isn't found in the argument you win. It's found in refusing to let someone else erase the life you know you lived. In the months that followed, I never moved back into the house. People often ask me why, as if winning meant reclaiming every room and every memory. But some places hold too much grief to become a home again. Richard's laughter still lived in those walls, yet so did the sound of the front door closing behind me the day I was told I no longer belonged. I didn't want my future measured against that moment. Instead, I accepted a fair settlement that recognized my legal interest and used it to buy a smaller home overlooking a quiet lake. Every morning, I opened the curtains to sunlight, reflecting across the water, instead of wondering whether I was welcome under someone else's roof. For the first time in years, peace wasn't something I was trying to preserve for everyone else. It belonged to me. Daniel and I spoke only once after everything was resolved. He arrived without warning, older somehow than the few months that had passed. He apologized, not perfectly, not eloquently, but honestly enough for me to believe he finally understood the difference between inheritance and entitlement. I accepted his apology without pretending the past hadn't happened. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It simply refuses to carry them forever. When he left, I wished him well. Not because he had earned another chance from me, because I had earned the freedom to stop living in the shadow of his choices. Richard once told me that the strongest foundations are the ones no one notices because they're buried beneath the surface, quietly carrying the weight of everything above them. I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. The money I invested built a house. The truth I protected rebuilt a life, and in the end, my greatest revenge wasn't taking back the walls that sheltered us. It was proving that no one can evict a woman from the truth she helped build.